Hello, how are you doing? Models, right. Oh, I've been marking those exam papers all week. I tell you, writing and running a good exam is probably almost as hard as sitting a good exam. It's exhausting. No real surprises. There were some good papers, some not so good papers, and some really good papers. So we're going to look at the nerves that innervate the muscles of the shoulder region, glenohumeral joint, that sort of thing. There are 6 main nerves. This is quite a useful exercise for me actually, because I know about all these nerves, but I'm bringing it all together in a nice organised manner for myself as much as for anything else. The other thing about exams, of course, is they're much easier to mark when students write the right answers. So by making these videos, I'm helping you, helping me, helping you, help me, something like that. So, I'm doing a lot of climbing at the moment, a lot of rock climbing. Shoulders are my thing, looking after my shoulders, making them strong, making them safe. So I'm very interested in the nerves that are innervating these muscles. So we'll just quickly review what the shoulder region is for. And the movements involved and the major muscles, and then we're going to look at the nerves. There are 6 big nerves, big important nerves, and then there are 2 pairs of less important nerves I want to talk about. So that's 10 nerves. That's quite a lot to do, right? We'll organise ourselves, we'll break it down. Of course, we're also going to be talking about the brachial plexus, but in no great detail. So the shoulder, the purpose of this joint is to enable us to put our hand in a wide range of 3-dimensional spaces. So it's a very mobile joint. The reason it's such a mobile joint is largely because the shoulder girdle is kind of floating from the axial skeleton. It's only anchored bonally at one point here. We've talked about this before. And the scapula can move around quite freely. And it's that movement of the scapula that gives us this wide range of movement. So, the muscles of the scapula are particularly important and interesting, and the nerves that innervate those muscles are particularly important, because if one of those nerves gets damaged, they're going to affect the function of the scapula, and they're going to affect the function of all of this. So the nerves I'm going to be talking about are, okay, the main 6, I don't even know if I can do these without. Accessory nerve, thoracodorsal nerve, long thoracic nerve, suprascapular nerve, dorsal scapular nerve, axillary nerve, was that 6 different nerves? And then the medial and lateral pectoral nerves, and the upper and lower subscapular nerves. It's a lot of nerves. So most of these muscles around here are having an effect on the shoulder, moving the humerus or the scapula. So we see serratus anterior here. This is the boxer's muscle. This runs between the ribs and the scapula. So we'll pull the scapula forward. We'll also anchor the scapula in place when you're moving your upper limb. We've got trapezius up here, running down to the scapula and the clavicle, and that can rotate the scapula. This is the muscle you use when you're shrugging your shoulders, trapezius. We've got the deltoid muscle here, which is the meat over your shoulder here, forming that curve, running from the clavicle, the clavicle and the scapula down to the humerus. I mix up clavicle and scapula sometimes, just it's a word thing, not a knowledge thing. And then of course anteriorly, got the pecs, got pectoralis major and pectoralis minor deep to that. And then we've got the big muscle, the really big muscle, this boy here. This is latissimus dorsi, the climber's muscle, the pull-up muscle. And then deep to all of this, we've got the muscles of the rotator cuff. So if I take off deltoid, we can then see the muscles of the rotator cuff are covering that flat surface of the scapular bone and running to the humerus. and there's teres major there, and then subscapularis on the other side. So it's all of these muscles that we're talking about with regards to innervation today. We have spinal nerves popping out from the spinal cord between the vertebrae, and the spinal nerves of level C5 through to T1 all come together to form what gets called the brachial plexus. The brachial plexus, any plexus, is just a whole bunch of nerves running together and then running off out again as new nerves. It's just wiring. It's like getting a load of wires, bundling them together with cable ties and then running them off again. But you've got to think of the nerves as the wires not being the big nerves that you can see, but the neurons inside, because there is some crossing over of the wires from one nerve to another nerve, right? But the brachial plexus is going to innervate most of the muscles of the shoulder, just because some of the nerves come off a bit early. But most of the muscles we're going to talk about, the nerves come from the brachial plexus, and the brachial plexus is then going to form the main nerves that are going to innervate the rest of the upper limb. So that's the brachial plexus. Most of the nerves will come from there. We should start with the most obvious one that doesn't, the accessory nerve, which is a cranial nerve. The accessory nerve is also known as cranial nerve 11, also gets called the spinal accessory nerve. So here's the brain and the brain stem, and this is then continuing as the spinal cord down here. So as cranial nerve 11, this is one of the last nerves to leave the medulla. There's a whole bunch of little rootlets here that come together to form the accessory nerve. Cranial nerve 11 forms from these little rootlets. All those rootlets run together and dive out from the skull through the jugular foramen. Now you might read that the accessory nerve goes through foramen magnum and the jugular foramen. What they're talking about there is those spinal rootlets going in. So going in through foramen magnum, the big hole, and then the nerve, once it's formed, goes out through the jugular foramen with the internal jugular vein and other bits and bobs, all right? So that's, you can see now, you get an idea of where it's starting. So the accessory nerve drops out of the skull here, and then it runs down within the neck. Now it's not on this model, but when we're dissecting, we'll look for it here. So this is sternocleidomastoid, and this is trapezius here. And we'll, so the floor here would be called this triangle made here would be called the posterior triangle of the neck. And we'd be looking in the floor for the accessory nerve. It pops out from sternocleidomastoid, kind of not really halfway along, maybe a third of the way up, and then runs across. So we can see it on this model. So here's sternocleidomastoid, and there we go. We see this nerve running across here, and it's that nerve that stands out because the accessory nerve runs out to trapezius. So the accessory nerve innervates sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius muscle. So it runs deep to trapezius, innervates trapezius, and then runs, carries on down on its deep surface, innervating the muscle. So that's the path of the accessory nerve. Drops out through the jugular foramen, runs through the floor of the posterior triangle, gets to trapezius and innervates trapezius. Trapezius does get a little bit of innervation from like C3 and C4 roots, but essentially the trapezius is innervated by the accessory nerve and allows you to shrug your shoulders. So if the accessory nerve is damaged, you will be unable to elevate your shoulders against resistance. Accessory nerve, okay? 1 down, 5 big ones to go. Since we're doing an A nerve, let's do another A nerve. So from the accessory nerve to the axillary nerve. Now the brachial plexus is running through the axilla. By that I mean the armpit, which is surrounded by muscles, which forms the axilla. Now the axillary nerve, that's what we can see in blue here, is a branch from the posterior cord of the brachial plexus. if you're trying to remember things like that. And then it runs through the axilla, but can you see it's diving posteriorly. So the axillary nerve is going to run through the axilla, but it's going to go out posteriorly and run around the posterior surface of the humerus here to get to this region. So it's going to innervate the deltoid muscle here. It's going to innervate deltoid. Okay, that's 2 down. We're up here. I think we can talk about the suprascapular nerve. Now think about the terminology here. Suprascapular. Seems obvious. This is the scapula here. It's going to go to the superior parts of the scapula. Now, it branches from the brachial plexus quite early. It branches from the superior trunk, and it runs through this notch here, this scapular notch. So once it's run through that notch, it's right by the supraspinatus muscle, but also infraspinatus on the other side. So the suprascapular nerve, see how it doesn't have to go very far to get to infraspinatus and supraspinatus. So that's the suprascapular nerve. That's 3. Right, we did suprascapular because it's a similar name. We'll do the dorsal scapular nerve. Now, got to watch out for this one because it is innervating a scapular muscle, but not one that's actually on the scapula. Now, the dorsal scapular nerve, I don't see on here. So the dorsal scapular nerve actually comes off from the 5th cervical spinal nerve, so from C5. We have scalene muscles in here. 3 scalene muscles, anterior, middle and posterior. And the dorsal scapular nerve will pop out, it'll go through the middle scalene muscle usually, and then it's going to run posteriorly, usually deep to levator scapulae. So it's running down here. So it's not running to the scapula, it's running to the bit between the scapula and the vertebrae. So where is the dorsal scapular nerve going? It's going to these guys here. These are the rhomboids. These are the muscles you use to pinch your shoulder blades together, right? So the rhomboids are innervated by the dorsal scapular nerve. The rhomboids are deep to trapezius. So the dorsal scapular nerve comes from C5, goes through the middle scalene muscle, usually stays deep to levator scapulae, and then deep to the rhomboids to innervate rhomboid major and rhomboid minor. Dorsal scapular nerve done. So now we're going to move back over this away a bit, and we'll move on to the thoracodorsal nerve. Yeah, they've got some similar terms. So thoraco, so we're not thinking scapula anymore, we're thinking thorax. We've got some big muscles in the wall of the thorax, and it's latissimus dorsi that's going to be innervated by the thoracodorsal nerve. All right, dorsal, because it's dorsal this is ventral, this is dorsal, anterior, posterior. Latissimus dorsi is dorsal. The thoracodorsal nerve is going to innervate latissimus dorsi. All right. So this being the thoracodorsal nerve, is coming from the posterior cord of the brachial plexus. Right. We're still keeping with that dorsal theme. Posterior cord, and it's going to. So the axilla is lined with muscles. It's just going to run posteriorly. So it's going to dive to the posterior part of the axilla and through there, and then bam, this is where latissimus dorsi is, right? You can see it, here it is. It's coming up around here. So the nerve just goes posteriorly through the axilla and bam, it's at latissimus dorsi, and it can follow latissimus dorsi and innervate it. So the thoracodorsal nerve runs dorsally or posteriorly to latissimus dorsi. Whew, right, what's next? The last one, so another thoracic one, is the long thoracic nerve. So the other big muscle of the thorax that I pointed out was serratus anterior. Serratus anterior is innervated by the long thoracic nerve. And it comes from spinal nerves C5, C6 and C7, and it goes, so it starts off quite high, but it's also going down through here. What's that called? The cervico-axillary canal or something. But through this space between the clavicle, scapula and the first rib. And as it goes down there, it's going to run down here, and then it's going to run, look, see where we are, it's going to run down the lateral wall of the thorax to get to serratus anterior. This is as far as serratus anterior extends. Now that means the long thoracic nerve is at risk during surgery or injury to this sort of region. So for example, breast surgery, there is a bit of a risk to the long thoracic nerve there. And if the long thoracic nerve is injured, that means serratus anterior loses its innervation. And as one of serratus anterior's big roles is anchoring the scapula to the thoracic cage when you're moving your upper limb, it leads to what gets called winging of the scapula. So for example, if you were to be pushing a car or doing a push-up, and normally serratus anterior would hold the clavicle, would hold the scapula in place while you put force through your upper limbs. If the long thoracic nerve is injured, serratus anterior is unable to do that job, so the scapula sticks out like a wing from the back. Classical anatomy. And that's it. That's the 6 major ones. Now I'm going to tag on the other little ones because they're worth mentioning, because we've got some other muscles that we haven't talked about yet, these guys and the other rotator cuff. If we deal with these guys first, because the naming is pretty easy. There are medial and lateral pectoral nerves. They come from the brachial plexus. The medial pectoral nerve comes from the medial cord. The lateral pectoral nerve comes from the lateral cord. It's handy, isn't it? Both of those nerves, I mean, you think about, you see where the brachial plexus is here, and the pectoralis minor muscle is running from these ribs just up to this tip here, and pectoralis major is covering that. As you can see here, you can imagine that these nerves don't have very far to go to get to the pectoralis muscles, right? The medial and lateral pectoral nerves are typically described as innervating both pectoralis major and minor, as in both nerves innervate both muscles together. The lateral pectoral nerve has a bigger job, though, innervating pectoralis major, and the medial pectoral nerve has a bigger job of innervating pectoralis minor. But when you'd ever need to know that information, I don't know. I don't know who you are or what you're doing. So the muscles we haven't innervated yet are, well, the big one is on the subscapular surface, so on the deep surface of the scapula. The muscle there is subscapularis. The nerves that innervate it are the upper and lower subscapular nerves, so that's nice. So remember that subscapularis is posterior. The subscapular nerves both come from the posterior cord of the brachial plexus, right? Posterior, makes sense. And again, you can see how they don't have to run very far. They're just running from the posterior cord posteriorly to subscapularis, which is going to be sat here on the deep surface of the scapula. The lower subscapular nerve is also going to innervate teres major. The axillary nerve will innervate teres minor. The lower subscapular nerve will innervate teres major. Funky levels of detail. Do you need to remember that? That's entirely up to you. But that's it. Those are the 2 pairs of minor muscles. There's a muscle called subclavius, right? underneath the clavicle, and it has the nerve to subclavius. That would kind of be the other one, but that's it. The 6 big nerves of the shoulder region, where they come from, where they go to, how they get there, the muscles that they innervate, and then those 2 pairs of more minor nerves, pectoralis and subscapular. Now that is a huge amount of information. I don't know how much of that you've taken on, but that's the organisation. The naming is a little bit difficult, but it will take some time to study. I guess the advantage of a video is you can watch it over and over again. There's a fair bit of repetition in here, and the purpose of that repetition is to try to pound those terms home, link these terms up. But it is it's not so much tricky stuff as much as that it's rote learning, and it's quite difficult to hold in your head for a long period of time. So if you feel like you understand all that, well done, good job, that's awesome. Right, hope I can find a simpler topic next week. See you guys next week, right?